The lake had always been my escape, a place where the water moved slower, the air felt cleaner, and time itself seemed to stretch, giving space for peace to breathe. My wife and I bought the old cabin on the North Ridge for that very reason. It wasn't fancy, cedar walls, a tin roof that sang in the rain, and a creaky porch that overlooked the still, glassy water. But it was ours, a place to unplug from the world, to reconnect, to build something lasting. At first, everything felt perfect. Mornings started with coffee on the dock, the smell of pine needles drifting through the air. Evenings ended with a fire pit glowing, laughter echoing across the lake from other cabins. The neighbors waved. People smiled. It felt like a small-town postcard, a slice of America that had somehow escaped the chaos outside its borders. But like any postcard, what you see isn't always the full picture. Because beneath the polite smiles and freshly painted mailboxes, there were rules, layers of them. And the people who enforced them were far more dangerous than they appeared. The Homeowners Association, the HOA, ran this community like clockwork. Officially, their job was to preserve property values and maintain neighborhood standards. Unofficially, they were the self-proclaimed guardians of perfection. There was a rule for everything: fence height, lawn color, dock paint, even the number of chairs you could have on your porch. And at the center of it all stood Karen McAllister, HOA president, self-appointed enforcer, and the kind of woman who wore authority like perfume. She lived 3 doors down from us, in the biggest cabin on the lake, white shutters, matching flower pots, a flagpole taller than her roof. Karen had that voice, the kind that always sounded like she was giving instructions, even when she wasn't. Every conversation was a power play, a way to remind you that this wasn't just her neighborhood. It was her kingdom. The other board members followed her lead like loyal soldiers. There was Greg, the vice president, a retired accountant who measured his self-worth by the number of HOA meetings he attended. Then there was Denise, the secretary, whose main contribution was gossip. Whispered updates about who had unpaid dues or who trimmed their hedge too late in the season. And finally Paul, the treasurer, quiet, meticulous, the type who smiled while sending you a fine notice for leaving your trash can out an hour too long. Together, they ran the community with the precision of a small-town regime. And in the beginning, I didn't think much of it. I kept my head down, paid my dues, and focused on fixing up the cabin. It was old and needed work, the kind of slow, hands-on labor that feels more like therapy than construction. My wife and I spent weekends sanding decks, repainting shutters, restoring the dock. We weren't here to stir trouble. We just wanted to make the place feel like home. The first sign of tension came quietly. One afternoon, Karen stopped by while I was repainting the gate. She didn't say hello, didn't comment on the work. She just stood there, clipboard in hand, and said, "That color isn't approved." I remember laughing, thinking she was joking. "It's just a shade of brown," I said. "Matches the rest of the cabin." She didn't smile. "It's close, but it's not on the list." She tapped her pen on the clipboard like a gavel. "You'll need to submit a paint approval form." It was such a small thing, a color, a rule, but it was the first crack in the peace we thought we had. I filled out her form, submitted the paperwork, and waited weeks for a reply. It came back stamped, "Denied." No explanation, just denied. That's when I realized something important. It wasn't about the paint. It was about control. Over the next few months, the notices started coming more often. A warning for a hose left uncoiled, a fine for parking too close to the edge of the gravel road, a courtesy reminder about trimming the pine branches that hung near the property line. Every letter came with that same HOA seal, bold, official, intimidating. Karen's name was always printed at the bottom. Still, we tried to play by the rules. My wife, ever the peacemaker, said it was better to stay on their good side. But it's hard to stay calm when the rules keep changing. Every week a new policy appeared, a new community standard. Suddenly, outdoor lighting had to be soft amber. Decorative signs were banned. Even bird feeders were restricted. Apparently, they attracted undesirable wildlife. The community began to feel less like a neighborhood and more like a surveillance zone. People whispered in driveways. Conversation stopped when Karen's SUV passed by. The same people who used to wave now nodded stiffly, afraid of being seen associating with anyone on the HOA's radar. The lake, once peaceful and quiet, had become a stage for petty politics. One evening I found a folded note taped to our gate. No signature, just typed words that read, "They're watching your renovations. Be careful what you fix." At first I thought it was a prank. But the next morning I noticed something else, a small circular camera lens hidden near the mailbox post. It was positioned perfectly to see the gate, the drive, and anyone walking toward the cabin. When I mentioned it at the next HOA meeting, Karen brushed it off. "We've installed security measures to protect the neighborhood," she said. "If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be concerned." Her tone was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that hides a threat. From that point on, it was like walking on eggshells. The sense of home began to shift. Every sound outside at night, a snapping twig, a passing car, felt like eyes on us. The air of community had turned into quiet paranoia. Then came the gate dispute. It started small, as always. A letter from the HOA claiming our front gate violated community guidelines. It was too rustic, they said, not aesthetically aligned with the neighborhood's modern look. I replied with documentation proving the gate predated the HOA's formation, grandfathered in by the original builder. Legally, they had no jurisdiction over it. But Karen didn't care about legalities. She cared about control. Weeks later, we came home from a trip to find the gate padlock missing. In its place was a flimsy chain and a bright orange tag reading, "Access restricted, pending compliance." My wife stood there, speechless. It was our land, locked by someone else. I reported the trespass to local law enforcement, but they shrugged. "It's an HOA issue," they said. "Take it up with them." That's when something changed in me. The patience, the restraint, it started to erode. I realized this wasn't just about a gate. It was about a group of people who believed they could decide what others could do, own, or build, even on their own property. And the more I pushed back, the more the pressure grew. Neighbors began to distance themselves. Greg, the vice president, stopped waving. Denise stopped making small talk. Even Paul, who once seemed reasonable, avoided eye contact. Karen's shadow hung over everything. Rumors started. Whispers that we were troublemakers, that we were planning to sell, that we didn't belong. One afternoon, as I was repairing a section of the dock, Karen showed up again. No clipboard this time, just a thin smile and a folder in her hand. "You've left us no choice," she said, handing it over. Inside were a stack of printed complaints, each signed by a different resident. "You violated too many bylaws," she continued. "We're filing for enforcement action. You'll need to vacate the cabin until it's resolved." Vacate. The word hit like a punch. My wife stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't evict us from our own land." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Watch me." Then she turned and walked away, her heels crunching the gravel with deliberate rhythm, one that sounded a lot like a countdown. That night, as the sun set over the lake, the air felt heavier than usual. The crickets were silent. Even the water seemed to hold its breath. I sat on the porch staring at the folder, wondering how far this would go, how far she would go. I could feel it deep down, in the same place you feel storms before they hit. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was personal, and though I didn't know it yet, what started with a paint color and a padlock was about to spiral into something far darker, a chain of events that would bring police lights to the lake, expose fake badges, and turn our quiet cabin into the center of a scandal that no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. Because in communities like this, power isn't enforced through law. It's enforced through fear. And Karen? She was about to learn what happens when she tries to control the wrong people. It started with a fine. Just one. $50 for an unauthorized structure. The structure, according to the letter, was the small planter box my wife had built near the front porch, a modest wooden rectangle filled with marigolds and rosemary. It wasn't even visible from the street, unless you craned your neck past the pine tree, but apparently it violated a bylaw about unapproved permanent fixtures. I called the HOA office that same afternoon, my voice tight but calm. "It's a planter," I said. "It's removable." "It's not even attached to the ground, Greg," the vice president answered with that signature tone of bureaucratic condescension. "Unfortunately, sir, the board has deemed it a permanent installation. You can submit an appeal, but until then, the fine stands." The fine stood. And then came another. And another, one for overgrown grass, though our lawn was barely 4 inches high. One for non-compliant outdoor lighting, though we hadn't changed a single bulb. Each envelope arrived like a slow drip of irritation, small enough to seem absurd, but steady enough to wear you down. At first we laughed about it. We joked that Karen must have binoculars trained on our yard 24 hours a day. But laughter turns to frustration when it starts costing you. When your mailbox feels like a slot machine that only ever pays out fines. When your weekends, once peaceful, become filled with compliance tasks. One Saturday morning, while repainting the gate to approved color specifications, I noticed a small SUV idling near the road. A woman sat inside, holding her phone at an angle that suggested she was filming. I waved. She didn't wave back, just lowered her window slightly and said, "Karen told me to document." Then she drove off. That's when I realized the HOA wasn't just policing, they were deputizing. Ordinary neighbors were becoming Karen's eyes and ears, reporting violations in exchange for small favors, waived dues, faster approval on home projects, or, in some cases, just the satisfaction of being part of something. The following week, a new letter arrived. This one accused us of unauthorized alterations to the dock we'd been restoring since the day we moved in. The letter demanded immediate removal of all non-compliant materials and included a notice that the HOA board would be conducting an inspection. Unannounced. I called the HOA hotline again. "You can't just come onto private property without notice," I said. Karen's voice this time, calm, precise. "It's in the bylaws," she said. Section 7.4, subsection C. Inspections may be conducted at any reasonable time to ensure community standards. "Reasonable?" I snapped. "You think trespassing is reasonable?" There was a pause. Then her voice sharpened. "We'll see you soon." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing phantom footsteps outside, the crunch of gravel where no one should be walking. At 2:17 a.m., a motion light flicked on by the shed. I went outside, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. No one was there. But in the morning, there was a fresh set of muddy footprints leading up to the dock, and back again. The inspection happened the next day. Karen, Greg, and Denise arrived in matching navy windbreakers with the HOA crest printed on the back. Clipboards in hand, they moved around the property like it was an archaeological dig site, snapping photos, muttering quietly to each other. My wife stood beside me, arms crossed, fury barely contained. When I asked what they were doing, Karen smiled. "Routine compliance verification," she said. "You'll receive a report within 48 hours. The report came with 3 new violations and a fine totaling $450. One for the dock, one for improper waste storage to our covered trash bin, and one for disruptive confrontation during official inspection." That last one felt personal. It was personal, word spread fast. Within days, other residents began whispering. Some avoided us altogether. Others, the ones who'd had their own run-ins with the HOA, started sharing stories. One man had been fined for using the wrong mulch color. Another was forced to replace his mailbox because it was too ornate. Someone even mentioned Karen had an informant list, neighbors who sent her photos of supposed violations. Then came the landscaping war. It started when our next-door neighbor, a retired man named Bill, decided to replace the grass between our driveways with decorative gravel. It looked nice, clean, and low maintenance, but Karen didn't like it. She claimed the gravel disrupted visual continuity. When the HOA ordered Bill to remove it, he refused. The next day, a code enforcement officer showed up with a citation. Bill ripped out the gravel in frustration, tossing it in a heap by the curb. A week later, someone slashed his garden hose. That's when I knew this wasn't isolated. It wasn't just about me. It was a system of intimidation. A quiet, methodical campaign to make anyone who resisted bend or break. I started keeping records. Photos, letters, timestamps. Every fine, every warning, every encounter. My wife called it our insurance file. I called it evidence. But the more I pushed back, the harder they hit. One morning, I came out to find a bright red notice taped to our door. HOA board meeting notice. Potential legal action discussion. It was humiliating. They'd plastered it where everyone could see. As I pulled the notice down, a neighbor across the street, Denise's cousin, shouted, "Maybe if you just followed the rules, this wouldn't happen." That night, I told my wife I wanted to attend the meeting in person. If they're going to talk about us, I said, they can do it to my face. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a spotless, over-air-conditioned space with fluorescent lights that hummed louder than the conversation. The board sat behind a folding table, like a panel of judges. Karen smiled when she saw me. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "how nice of you to join us." "Seems you've been discussing me," I replied. Her smile didn't fade. "We discuss community matters, Mr. Lawson. Your property happens to be one of them." For the next hour, they dissected my pattern of noncompliance, the paint, the gate, the dock, the planters. Every so-called offense was read aloud like an indictment. I tried to explain, to reason, to show my photos and documentation, but Karen cut me off every time. "This isn't a debate," she said coldly. "It's a hearing." By the end, the board voted unanimously to pursue mandatory compliance enforcement. In plain language, they were taking me to court. It was surreal. A neighborhood I'd once loved now felt like a trap. The people who'd once waved now looked away. Even the lake seemed to turn cold, mirroring the hostility in the air. My wife tried to stay strong, but I saw it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the fear. Every knock on the door made her flinch. Every letter in the mailbox felt like another attack. Then, one morning, things escalated beyond paper. I walked outside to find our mailbox ripped from its post, bent in half. The planter box, the same one that started it all, had been smashed, flowers scattered across the dirt. There was no note, no signature, but I didn't need one. I knew who had done it, or at least who'd inspired it. I called the sheriff's office again. The deputy took one look, sighed, and said, "Unless you have video, there's not much we can do. Maybe install some cameras." So I did. 6 of them, hidden, front, back, dock, gate, garage. Within a week, I caught movement, people I didn't recognize walking around the property at night. One even wore an HOA windbreaker. That's when I found it, the hidden bylaw. I'd been combing through the HOA's charter page by page when I stumbled across Section 14.9. In cases of repeated or unresolved noncompliance, the association may assume temporary possession of a property to perform necessary corrective measures. Temporary possession. Those 2 words sent a chill down my spine. It meant they could enter my land, make changes, and bill me for the cost, all without consent. And that was exactly what they were building toward. A few days later, I came home from work to find contractors on my property. They were repainting the gate, their approved color. Karen stood by supervising, sipping iced tea. When I shouted at them to stop, she turned to me with that same smug calm. "You were given notice," she said. "No, I wasn't." She smiled wider. "Check your email." It was sent this morning. My inbox showed the message. Time-stamped 20 minutes earlier. I took photos, recorded video, called my lawyer. He told me what I already knew. It was illegal. But enforcing that legality would take time, and Karen was counting on that. Every move she made was a step ahead, designed to break me down before I could fight back. That night, I confronted her in front of her house. It wasn't planned, I just snapped. I demanded to know why she was targeting us, why she was twisting rules to make our lives miserable. She didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. "You don't understand," she said. "If I let you get away with it, everyone thinks they can. Order has to start somewhere." "Order?" I laughed bitterly. "This isn't order. It's tyranny." She stepped closer. Her perfume hit me, sharp, chemical, like cleaning fluid. "Then maybe you shouldn't live somewhere that values standards." I didn't sleep that night. Neither did my wife. Every creak of the cabin sounded like an intruder. Every gust of wind against the window felt like a warning. The next morning, another envelope waited on the porch. This one was hand-delivered, no stamp, no return address. Inside was a single page, A final notice of foreclosure proceedings for outstanding violations and dues. They were trying to take our home. I stared at the letter, my hands trembling. My wife broke down crying at the kitchen table. That's when I made a decision. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. I spent the next week documenting everything. Every video, every letter, every interaction. I reached out to neighbors who'd also been harassed, and they came forward one by one. Stories of threats, fake citations, and shady financial records. Together we began connecting dots. Money that didn't add up. Contracts awarded to Karen's cousin's company. Fines that disappeared from the books. I was building a case, but Karen must have sensed it. Because suddenly the HOA escalated again, this time filing an emergency injunction claiming I was interfering with community operations. A sheriff's deputy showed up with papers. My wife cried again. I felt something inside me fracture, the kind of quiet breaking that doesn't make a sound, but changes everything. The stress took over our lives. I stopped sleeping. My wife stopped smiling. Even our dog grew nervous, pacing near the windows like he could feel the tension. I started waking up at 3 a.m., sitting on the porch with a cup of cold coffee, watching headlights move through the trees. That's when I noticed something. The same car, night after night, stopping at the corner, idling for a few minutes, then driving away. I started recording. Every night, every visit, and one evening, when I zoomed in on the license plate, I froze. It was registered to the HOA. They weren't just harassing me. They were watching me. By then, I was no longer just angry. I was determined. This wasn't about a gate or a fine anymore. It was about exposing what was really happening behind those polished meetings and fake smiles. Because in communities like this, control doesn't come from rules. It comes from fear. And Karen had spent years building her empire of it, but she'd made one mistake. She assumed fear would keep me quiet. And as I stared at that car's license plate on my screen, a plan began to form, one that would turn her power against her, one that would expose the rot beneath the perfect lawns and white fences. And though I didn't know it yet, that plan would lead to the night everything came crashing down. The sirens, the headlines, and the moment the entire community finally saw the truth about their so-called president. The HOA wanted obedience. They were about to get war. The night it all came to a head was colder than usual for early spring, the kind of sharp, restless chill that carried a warning in the wind. The lake was dark and glassy, the moonlight catching on its ripples like a mirror trembling under pressure. I was sitting on the porch with my laptop open, finalizing the last of the evidence. The folders on my desktop were neatly labeled: financial fraud, illegal enforcement, false notices, surveillance footage. I'd spent weeks gathering it all. Every photo, every timestamp, every voice recording. My wife came out with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from fighting a battle you never asked for. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked softly. I didn't look up from the screen. They took everything from us except our voice. "I'm done staying quiet." At that moment, headlights appeared at the end of the dirt road. A vehicle slowed, then stopped just beyond the gate. It wasn't unusual for cars to drive by, not anymore, but something about the way it idled, engine humming in the still air, made my stomach twist. I zoomed in with the security camera feed. Black SUV, no plates, and then the gate lock clicked. I stood, heart pounding. The sound was unmistakable. Metal meeting metal. The deliberate rotation of a key that shouldn't exist. My wife stepped behind me, her voice trembling. "Jason, someone's here." I grabbed the flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it toward the gate. The beam caught 3 figures stepping out of the SUV, flashlights in hand, wearing dark jackets that gleamed under the light. "Who's there?" I shouted, no answer. They moved closer. When the light hit their faces, my breath caught. Karen was in front, clipboard in hand, flanked by Greg and Denise. Behind them, 2 men I didn't recognize, bulky, silent, moving like they were on a mission. "Karen," I said, voice hard. "You're trespassing." She smiled. That same chilling, practiced smile that had become her signature. "We're here on official HOA business," she said. "Final enforcement." My wife gripped my arm. "Final what?" Karen gestured to one of the men. He handed her a thick envelope, which she held up like a trophy. Per Section 14.9 of the Association Charter, the HOA reserves the right to take temporary possession of non-compliant properties. Your continued violations and refusal to cooperate have forced our hand. I stepped forward. You think you can just take our home? She didn't flinch. Not take. Repossess. For the good of the community. The arrogance in her tone made my blood boil. Behind her, Greg was recording on his phone, documenting everything as if this were some kind of victory parade. I took a slow breath. You don't have legal authority to do this. Karen's grin widened. Actually, we do. We've already filed the paperwork with the county. I had been expecting this, anticipating it. And what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd already spoken to the county clerk myself. There was paperwork filed, but not the kind she thought funny, I said, because the county's been very interested in your filings lately, especially the ones connected to your cousin's construction company. The shift in her expression was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of hesitation before the mask slipped back into place. You have no idea what you're talking about. Oh, I do, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. And so does the sheriff's office. I sent them everything. For a split second, the silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Greg snorted. You think a bunch of screenshots are going to save you? My wife stepped forward, holding up her own phone. Not screenshots, recordings, bank statements, emails. Karen's eyes darted between us, calculating. This is harassment, she snapped. Harassment? I said, taking another step closer. You forged documents, fined families into debt, and sent people to intimidate us at night. You broke into our property, Karen. You broke the law. The two men behind her shifted uneasily. One glanced toward the SUV. The confidence in Karen's posture faltered. That's when the sound came. Distant but unmistakable. The sharp echo of sirens winding. Through the trees, her head whipped toward the road. You called the cops? I smiled. You did. Her brow furrowed. I lifted my phone and hit play. From the speaker came her voice, recorded days earlier, barking orders to have them removed by any means necessary. She'd said it over the phone, thinking she was talking to one of her loyal contractors. She had no idea I was recording. Her face went pale. You recorded me? You threatened my wife, I said coldly. Of course I did. The sirens grew louder, the pulsing red and blue lights cutting through the fog. Karen's composure cracked completely. She turned to Greg. Get that footage. We'll claim he assaulted us. Greg started forward, phone still raised. But before he could reach me, the first patrol car screeched to a stop behind their SUV. Two deputies stepped out, one of them the same officer who'd been here weeks ago. He recognized me immediately. Mr. Lawson, he called. We got your message, Karen straightened, regaining some of her fake poise. Officers, she said smoothly, thank goodness you're here. This man is trespassing on HOA-managed property and threatening board members, the deputy frowned. Ma'am, this is his property. We've already confirmed ownership, she blinked, thrown off. That can't be right. There's an active case pending. There was, he interrupted. But the county dismissed it this afternoon. He turned to me. You were right about the paperwork. It was fraudulent. The silence that followed was pure electricity. My wife covered her mouth, eyes wide. Karen just stood there, frozen, every ounce of control she'd clung to slipping through her fingers. The second deputy stepped forward. Ma'am, we need to see your identification. Karen hesitated. I don't have it on me. Greg started to back away, muttering under his breath. Denise stared at the ground as if wishing she could disappear. The first deputy spoke again, voice firm. We also have a warrant to seize HOA financial records pending investigation into a misappropriation of funds. Karen Halloway, you're listed as the primary officer of record. Her jaw fell open. You can't be serious. I'm afraid we are, the deputy replied. You need to come with us. Karen took a step back. This is ridiculous. You're making a huge mistake. But when she turned, the second deputy was already behind her, cuffs in hand, watching her face in that moment, the flash of disbelief, the crumble of pride, the raw, naked panic. It felt like the weight of months of torment collapsing all at once. Greg dropped his phone. Denise whispered something about not knowing anything. The two hired men retreated toward the SUV, only to be stopped by another patrol car pulling up behind them. Karen struggled as they cuffed her. "You don't understand," she shouted. "I run this community." The deputy's voice was steady, almost pitying. "Not anymore." They led her toward the cruiser. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the night like the closing of a chapter I'd been trapped in for too long. But it wasn't over yet. The deputies spent the next hour going through her SUV, pulling out file boxes, loose papers, even an external hard drive. They asked if I'd be willing to provide my copies of correspondence and recordings for their investigation. I nodded. Every word, every document, every photo I had, I was ready to hand it all over. When they finally drove away, red and blue lights fading into the dark, the lake was quiet again. Too quiet. My wife stood beside me, shivering slightly. "Is it really over?" she whispered. I stared at the gate, the same gate that had started everything. The fresh paint gleamed under the porch light, a sick reminder of their intrusion. "Almost," I said. The following week was a whirlwind. News spread fast, faster than I expected. Local reporters showed up. Residents who had once avoided us now came knocking, sharing their own stories of Karen's harassment. One man had lost his savings fighting a bogus lien. A single mother was nearly evicted over a garden shed. Each story was a piece of the same puzzle, a network of fear and control that Karen had built over years. But now it was unraveling. The county opened a full investigation into the HOA's finances. Karen faced charges of fraud, falsifying legal documents, and conspiracy to commit extortion. Greg resigned within days. Denise vanished from the neighborhood altogether. The board dissolved under pressure, replaced by an interim committee made up of actual residents. When I attended the first new meeting, the energy was different. Nervous, but hopeful. People spoke freely, some for the first time in years. I didn't say much, just listened. But when someone asked me if I'd stay in the community, I looked out the window toward the lake and said, maybe. But not because of what it was, because of what it might become. Still, the scars ran deep. Even as the weeks passed, I caught myself glancing at the gate whenever a car slowed on the road. My wife jumped at sudden knocks. There was a lingering unease, like the ghost of Karen's control still hovered in the air. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. This time from the county court. It wasn't a fine, not a notice, not a threat. It was a ruling. All claims by the HOA against the Lawsons are hereby dismissed. Property ownership and improvements are confirmed as lawful. I read it 3 times, barely believing it. My wife cried when she saw it. For the first time in months, she smiled without that shadow behind her eyes. That evening, we walked down to the dock. The water was calm, golden under the sunset, the same dock they'd called a violation, the same dock where I'd stood the night everything changed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the broken HOA seal I'd kept from one of the fake notices. I tossed it into the lake. It sank without a sound. "This place finally feels like ours," she said quietly. "It always was," I replied. As the sun slipped below the horizon, I thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the anger, the helplessness. How close we'd come to losing everything because of one woman's hunger for control. But I also thought about how it ended, not with violence, but with truth. With proof, with justice. And maybe that's the thing about people like Karen. They believe power is control, that if they make enough noise, throw enough weight around, people will bow. But the moment you stop being afraid, their power disappears. That night, as we locked the gate and turned toward the house, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not the fragile kind that can be taken away, but the solid kind you earn, piece by piece, after surviving something you never should have had to. Karen's name would be whispered for a while, a cautionary tale in a town that had finally learned what happens when people give too much power to the wrong hands. And as for me, I didn't want revenge anymore. I just wanted quiet, the kind of quiet that meant safety. But deep down, I knew this. If anyone ever tried to take that peace away again, they'd learn exactly how far I was willing to go to protect what's mine. Because this wasn't just a home anymore. It was proof that standing your ground, even against the people who think they own everything, is sometimes the only way to win. The morning after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't mean peace but aftermath. The kind that comes when a storm has passed, and everyone steps outside to see what's left standing. I remember opening the front door and just standing there, breathing in the cool air. The same streets that had once felt suffocating under Karen's control now seemed hollow. The banners were gone. The cameras she'd installed at the corners were being taken down by county workers. Even the HOA's notice board, once plastered with warnings and threats, stood empty, the glass cracked, the lock hanging open. It felt like walking through the ruins of an empire. A few of the neighbors lingered by their driveways, talking in hushed tones. For the first time in months, no one looked at me with suspicion or fear. Some even nodded as I passed, hesitant gestures of acknowledgement, but real nonetheless. By noon, word had spread everywhere. Karen's mugshot was circulating online, her charges listed in bold: fraud, extortion, misuse of funds, and abuse of authority. The HOA's bank account was frozen. Investigators were combing through years of documents, unraveling everything she'd hidden. What shocked everyone most wasn't just the corruption. It was how deep it went. Karen had created fake maintenance contracts, redirected community improvement funds into personal accounts, and even charged residents for repairs that never happened. The truth hit like a tidal wave. People who had once defended her were suddenly scrambling to distance themselves. Greg deleted his social media and resigned publicly, claiming he'd been manipulated. Denise gave an emotional statement to the local paper saying she had no idea what Karen was doing. But everyone knew. Maybe they hadn't known the details, but they'd felt the rot. They just hadn't wanted to face it. Within a week, the county commissioner's office announced that the HOA would be temporarily suspended pending investigation. A neutral property management company was brought in to handle operations while a community vote would determine the HOA's future. That meeting, the one where we voted, was the first time I saw everyone in the same room since this began. It was held in the community center, the same building Karen had once refused to let me use for a neighborhood barbecue. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Folding chairs filled the hall, whispers rippling through the crowd as people filed in. I sat near the back, next to my wife, quietly observing. On the stage, a county representative explained the process. New leadership, new bylaws, full transparency going forward. Then he asked for open comments. Hands shot up immediately, one by. One resident stood to speak, some angry, some embarrassed, some near tears. "Karen fined me for painting my mailbox," one man shouted. "Said it wasn't the approved shade of black." "She made me take down my wheelchair ramp," an older woman said, voice trembling. "Said it wasn't aesthetically pleasing." "She tried to evict my tenants for having too many potted plants," someone else added. The room buzzed with outrage. Years of bottled frustration came pouring out, stories colliding, overlapping. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone she'd silenced, everyone who'd lived under her thumb. And then the county representative turned toward me. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "would you like to speak?" For a moment I didn't move. My wife touched my arm, whispering, "You should." So I stood. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Some apologetic, some expectant. I walked to the front, my footsteps echoing in the quiet that followed. I didn't have a speech prepared. I didn't need one. "I moved here because I thought this was a place people looked out for each other," I began. "I thought the HOA was supposed to protect our homes, not take them from us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. When they came after me, it felt personal. But I see now that it wasn't just me. It was anyone who questioned them, anyone who didn't fit their idea of perfect. I took a slow breath. We let it happen because it was easier to stay quiet, because we told ourselves it was just rules, just procedures. But that's how people like Karen thrive. Not because they're powerful, but because we let them be. A heavy silence settled over the room. Whatever we decide to build after this, I said, let's make sure it's something real, not fear dressed up as order, not control disguised as community. When I sat back down, the applause started slow, hesitant, then grew until it filled the room. By the end of that night, the vote was unanimous. The old HOA was dissolved. The board would be replaced entirely, and a new system of open, resident-led governance would take its place. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a start over the next few months. The neighborhood changed in ways I never thought possible. The approved landscaping list vanished. People started planting again, real gardens this time, filled with color and life. Kids rode bikes down the street without parents worrying about fines for noise violations. Someone even organized a block party. For the first time since moving here, I felt like I lived in a community, not a dictatorship. As for Karen, her trial became a spectacle. The courtroom was packed every day. Reporters lined the steps outside. Evidence after evidence was presented. Emails, forged documents, bank transfers. She tried to shift blame, but it was useless. The proof was ironclad. When the verdict came down, guilty on all major counts, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like closure. She was sentenced to serve 5 years in prison, with additional restitution to the homeowners she'd defrauded. The court ordered the sale of her property to repay part of the stolen funds. Her house, once the symbol of her authority, was auctioned off, stripped of its ornate fences and cameras, the day they took down the private HOA president. Resident sign from her front yard, I stood across the street and watched. The wind carried away the dust like erasing a name from history, but even as her presence faded, the impact of what she'd done lingered. People still flinched when they got official-looking mail. Meetings sometimes turned tense, haunted by the memory of her reign. Healing wasn't instant. It took time. For me and my wife, it took even longer. There were nights I'd wake up at 2 a.m., heart pounding, half expecting headlights outside the gate again. Every creak of the porch made me reach for my phone, instinctively checking the cameras. But gradually, the fear began to fade. We focused on rebuilding, not just the house, but our lives. I repaired the dock, added new railings, planted fresh cedar trees along the fence line. My wife started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. She turned the old shed, once targeted by Karen for unapproved structures, into a studio.